Greetings, human beings. Welcome. This is the fifth episode of Unlicensed Therapist, a platform where we dissect the human experience in the 21st century and explore how we think, how we relate, and how we believe. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please take a quick second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you can be informed when we have future episodes. If you're hearing this on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other streaming platform, please give us a rating. All of this really helps get the show in front of more people. And as you know, we just started out, so I really, really appreciate your support. So the whole world is talking about Israel and Palestine, but what do people on the ground there really think? Today, I'm speaking with Corey Gil-Shuster, who's an academic at Tel Aviv, Israel. He lives in Tel Aviv, Israel, who spent more than a decade taking a camcorder and translators as needed into the cities and towns in the West Bank and in Israel, asking questions to ordinary people that his viewers send him and recording their answers. He has asked Palestinians in Ramallah what they think of Hamas. He's asked Israelis whether they want to nuke Gaza. The responses are always diverse and always interesting. He has over 300,000 subscribers now on his YouTube channel, which is called the Ask Project. He has over 1,000 videos there and over 130 million views. So with that, Corey's Ask an Israeli, Ask a Palestinian project called the Ask Project has become one of the most compelling, riveting, and educational channels online today. And his perspective on the situation is unique and informed in a way that very few commentators today are. So, Corey, thanks for doing this. It's really an honor to have you on here.
You're very welcome. Happy to be here. I have to correct you. I'm not an academic. I work at the university, but as a manager, and I work with academics, and they would get a little annoyed because I don't have a PhD to be called an academic.
Well, there's nothing wrong with
academic in any way.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with annoying academics, honestly. But that's something. So that's been kind of written about you. I think I did read an article in the National Post where they said an Israeli academic is going out in the streets. So. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not true. No, I think I had them corrected because I know someone will get mad and say he's pretending to be an academic. I'm not an academic. I'm not pretending.
Okay. All right. That sounds good. So I'll keep that in mind. But so you're also Canadian like me. So we have, I'm having my Tim Hortons coffee right now. So where did you grow up? When did you move to Israel? And how did the Ask Project start?
Okay, so I grew up in Ottawa. I lived most of my life in Ottawa. I lived in Montreal for about 5 years as well. And I have family in Toronto. I moved to Israel sort of off and on in 1989 to 1991, and then 1993 to 1990, around that time. So I was there during the Oslo years. So first Intifada, Oslo years, second Intifada. And then I came back to Ottawa for about 7 years because the second Intifada was intense. And then I moved back in 2010. So I've been in Israel for 20-something years. Why did I start the Ask Project? What I noticed is that people talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they have never been here. They're generally not Israeli or Palestinian. They don't know what it's like to actually be here, and they often get a lot of things wrong. There's a grain of truth in what a lot of people say, but it's covered in so many layers of exaggeration, hyperbole, misinformation. There's a lot of misinformation, and it always annoys me. I'm a little on the spectrum when it comes to. I say that jokingly. I'm not actually on the spectrum as far as I know. But I get very annoyed when people make claims that are not true about either side. And it's not just about the Israeli side, that I lived on the Israeli side and I'm Jewish. And it's when people say things that are not technically true and then go off on a tangent about it. So I had this idea that somebody actually challenged me to prove Israelis weren't racist. They can be racist, like anybody can be racist. But her claim was that they're all racist and all racist against Arabs all the time, whatever. And she said, what are you going to do? Go out and ask people. And I thought, I have a video camera. Why am I not doing that? That's an excellent idea. So I challenged people to give me a question. This was in an online forum. I tell the story all the time. And what I think is interesting is that 30 people in this online forum who claim to be absolute experts on Israel, Palestine. Again, none of them are Israeli. None of them are Palestinian. They're all experts. And I say, give me a question to ask Israelis. And none of them had a question. I thought that was a little strange.
Yeah.
Finally, somebody claimed that, yes, a one-state solution Israelis will agree to. And I said, great, I'm turning it into a question. And so that was my first video, 2012.
So you said that there are a lot of the things that you hear, a lot of claims that you hear are wrong. What would you say maybe are the top claims, maybe the top one or two claims on either side in your experience that feel the most wrong to you, where you just feel like you will just want to shake people and say, no, that's not true?
Okay, so and after this, I'll probably think of like 10 more that annoy me more. But okay,
Yeah.
so this idea that Israelis are all white colonialists,
Right.
it kind of gets on my nerves. First of all, let's start with white. The concept of white doesn't even exist here. There's no. If I said, "Are you white?" they would stare at me and go, "What are you talking about? That doesn't make that word doesn't exist." So you probably think European. So only 40% or less than 40%, 30-something% of the population of Israeli Jews are European Jews. 60% are Jews from Arab and Muslim countries, and then there's a few from Ethiopia and some other groups of Jews. I'm just talking the Jews. Besides the fact that 20% of the population of Israel, of citizens of Israel, not Palestinians, are Muslim, Christian, Druze, Circassian. This is a very multicultural society. Yes, a lot of the leaders are white, as they are European. They don't call themselves white. That makes no sense in this context. And so that kind of annoys me, that the majority culture here is actually brownish, mocha, if anything. And so you have two brown peoples, basically, meaning Palestinians and Israelis, in some kind of war. They actually have very similar cultures. There's this other, it leads into every other misconception of Israelis have no culture and they stole the culture from the Palestinians. Most Israelis, again, 60%, come from Moroccan, Yemenite, Iraqi, Egyptian, grandparents, great-grandparents. And so, of course, their cultures are somewhat similar. Not the same as Palestinian. Palestinians do have a different culture. Every country has a different culture, but they have very similar cultures. And
and many of them were expelled from the Arab countries as well, right?
Yes,
Around the time.
yes. It's a big mix of moving and movement towards Israel and actually being expelled and thrown out. Yes, absolutely. So, so on any level, in any historical recounting, I'm sure, and we can get, you can get into these arguments of what, in 1948 with Palestinians, were they expelled or did they flee? Did they? Everyone's going to have an opinion on that, depending on who you're talking to. And all I actually care about is clearing up how it feels from the first person perspective. So if I'm an Israeli who, and I consider myself a Canadian here, I actually have citizenship, but I consider myself total Canadian. My values are very Canadian. If I'm a native born Israeli who had grandparents from Morocco, Yemen, Poland, and Iraq, which is a common mix, by the way, what do I feel as an Israeli and how do I see myself? And the same thing, if I were Palestinian, I want to know what they feel. How do they see themselves within the context of this conflict?
Right. So, okay, so that's the white part, and so what you mentioned about 1/5 of Israelis being Arab. That's surprisingly a lot of people who are very vocal on this, especially on social media, actually don't even know that. I've come across a surprising number of people who don't know that 1/5 of the population of Israel is actually Arab. And so that's one of the things that you were talking about, the white aspect. What about on the Palestinian side? What's something that really you feel is just very widely understood based on your conversations with people?
I'm trying to think of things that are misunderstood okay. So people often come with me to the West Bank. I go to, by the way, because people often claim, oh, you don't actually go into the West Bank and you don't go to Palestinian areas. I'm in the West Bank, Palestinian areas, towns, villages, refugee camps.
Yeah.
And when I take people who are Canadian, American, European to a refugee camp, for example, which is a small portion of Palestinians, but in the West Bank, they are always surprised that people aren't living in tents and people aren't poor like they would be in India. They are sure that that's what a refugee means. And that hasn't existed for a lot of years, meaning at the beginning in 1948, 49, 50, of course that existed. Today, they live in homes, small homes in a refugee camp. It's very crowded, but homes. There are areas of Tel Aviv and Bnei Brak and other areas in Israel which look exactly the same as a refugee camp in the Palestinian territories. So a lot of people have this idea that Palestinians are poor and live like you imagine people in Egypt living, or people in India, or in other places with extreme poverty. There is not extreme poverty in the West Bank. Palestinians in the West Bank are poorer than average Israelis, but the average Israeli is also much poorer than the average Canadian by far. It's very third world here. It is very, nothing, and we can get into that if you want, how the discrepancy of what people think Israel is or Palestine is and what is reality on the ground.
Yeah. And in Gaza, you think that, the Gaza and West Bank are different, right?
Gaza and West Bank are different. I was in Gaza once in 1990, so I can't really judge. I've met people from Gaza. They're different also a little bit culturally, a little bit. So that's another thing. Well, it's not so much people outside, but people in Israel have this idea that all Arabs are the same and all Palestinians are the same. And there are slight differences between different areas within Palestine, within the West Bank and Gaza. Palestine, the amount of poverty, I know, at least according to the numbers, it is a much poorer place. But again, this is another thing that annoys me. Again, it's that little spectrum thing that bugs me. When before, I've been hearing for 20 years about it's the largest open air prison, people are suffering. And people tell me things, I accept it. Okay, I'll accept that. Now, since the war, all I see is videos from Palestinians showing how beautiful Gaza was. And you see the country club, and you see the luxury hotel, and you see the luxury restaurants, and you see the mall, and it's all destroyed now because Israel went after the wealthy people, because that's where the money comes from. So now I know that the average Palestinian in Gaza, the average Gazan was pretty poor, much poorer than the average person in the West Bank by far. But I don't like when people set up this narrative of trying to create a victim mentality. And it happens with Israelis, it happens with Palestinians. Each side, everyone in conflict does this. But it still annoys me. I'd rather look at what reality is and then where do we go from there?
Yeah. So speaking of reality, so you've been doing this for over 10 years now. And what I really respect about what you do is the way that you listen. So, and this I've seen, around, you've got over 1,000 videos on YouTube. I think from what I know, around almost half of them are from Palestinians, right? Where you're speaking to them.
Yeah.
And
there's a little less Palestinians than Israelis, but because it's easier for me to ask it in Israel. So
absolutely. And still, considering that, like almost half, like I think over 400 videos are from the speaking Palestinian people
from West Bank Palestinians.
Yeah. But it seems you're more curious, like you said, to understand what people think and why, rather than have a debate or an argument. So I've seen you here. You're standing there talking to people, and some of them are, most of them seem really decent. Like most of them seem like really pleasant people, but some of them say really outlandish things. And I should again note that those are usually a minority in the number of people that you interview. But you hear this and you keep a pretty straight face the whole time because you're listening. So do you? Yeah, and I assume that's hard sometimes. But do you think Israelis and Palestinians can eventually understand each other in the way that you have been trying or seeking to understand them?
It's hard. It's hard in a conflict. People, after so many years, 100 years of conflict, 100 years of each side trying to kill the other, even not within their each person's narrative is we're protecting ourselves. We're not the aggressors, but each one is acting at both as an aggressor and as a victim. It's really hard because everyone is really stuck in their own narrative, in their own little bubble of whatever information they have, and how they're right and the other is wrong, how we're good and the other is bad. It's typical of conflicts. I can't say this is anything unique. But you need a break in a conflict for enough time for people to calm down, for another generation to grow up in a different reality where you can ask questions. And when the conflict is ongoing and the violence is ongoing all the time, even if you guys don't hear about it in the news, both sides are suffering to some extent. It's hard. It's really, really hard. And I think now, because we might as well talk about October 7th and everything that's happening, since October 7th, there is a huge change on the Israeli side of whereas you would have a certain amount of the population before who was open to compromise and in dealing with the Palestinians, and you had far less of that on the Palestinian side. Far fewer Palestinians were willing to compromise with Israelis. Now they're kind of equal in the level of hatred towards each other. At least that's my what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing. And we'll have to see if when the war is over, if it stays that way. I don't know.
Yeah. So when, like you said, it does take time. You do need an area, a period of time when things calm down, so people can actually think clearly. And there's less of the tribal, and this is easier said than done. I mean, I'm sitting here and talking about it, but I know it's a lot harder. And so, what about you personally? So, how did the events of October 7th and its aftermath, now the war in Gaza and everything that's happening that you've seen, it's been, for over 3 months now. How has that changed the way that you see things? And do you still feel, I mean, the underlying premise of your conversations, it seems, is that, there's this sense that I get of hope that, these conversations are possible. You're having them because they're possible. But do you still have hope after that these conversations can be possible?
Well, I don't think I had hope before this, by the way. Maybe you're misconstruing what I'm thinking. I'm using my Canadian self, and I'm also behind. It's a little bit of a trick that when you're in an emotional situation and you're behind a camera, like you're holding a camera, you're looking through a screen. I look through the screen to sort of not on purpose, so I don't get emotionally affected by what people are saying. And actually, it's a good tool that I kind of just figured out as it was happening.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking from the viewer's perspective, there's no point in me getting mad if, because the viewer doesn't understand why I'm getting angry because they don't feel the same way I do. So I don't know if I had much hope before. Since October 7th, so to understand it from our perspective, I watched it happening on October 7th live as it was happening, with Palestinians sending me videos of Israelis being slaughtered. And I was sure it was Syria, and it wasn't here, and it couldn't possibly have been here. And I realized, first of all, it's here, because then I started watching the news and realized it is true. And Palestinians friends were sending me videos of it happening, but there were hearts on it while Israelis are being slaughtered. People were enjoying it. People were watching this as sport. I mean, Palestinians were watching this with glee of Israeli civilians, not soldiers, Israeli civilians being murdered. And it's going to be very hard for me. I haven't been back to the West Bank in 3 months. It's going to be very hard for me to remain without that emotion. And I'm going to have to ask, do you agree with what happened on October 7th? What's one of my questions? I have to ask it because somebody already sent it to me. And I know from polling, 75% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza absolutely support what happened on October 7th to civilians. They absolutely support it. That's going to be very hard for me. It's also hard for me, to be fair, when I've heard Israelis say really horrible things similar to that, where Israelis don't celebrate exactly because it's not the culture is a bit different. How you express it is a little bit different. But I've met, there's one video, I can't even remember what I asked, but I remember somebody saying, if somebody threw rocks at you, wouldn't you shoot them? And I said no. And this was and in my case, the person who threw rocks at me was an 8-year-old kid, and he said I would shoot him. And I was like horrified that this 30-something-year-old Israeli guy was talking about, this is years ago, this is not now, was talking about, yes, I would shoot an 8-year-old child. Now, maybe he was doing it to sound tough, the way Palestinians do to sound tough. Maybe, I don't know. But it's hard to be asking people these questions and to hear such horrible, awful things about human beings. Yeah. And so what I'm doing is Unlike most Israelis are watching the destruction of Gaza, not with glee. I can't say that. That I don't hear, but I hear of they deserve it. You know, what's happening to them. They support Hamas, which is true, by the way. This whole thing of, okay, they voted in Hamas. Most people support Hamas to some extent. Not 100%, but to some extent. And if you ask them why they don't support Hamas, by the way, I'm just kind of going back, even this has nothing to do with October 7th. This is before. They'll say, oh, no, they're too religious. They're not because they're too radical. It's not because they're too religiously radical, they'll say. But in terms of how they fight Israel, no, that's legitimate. That's okay. The majority of Palestinians really believe that violent resistance is absolutely legitimate. And to some extent, doing that to civilians is somewhat legitimate. And because they feel weak. And I understand they feel very weak and they feel this is their only way to get back Palestine. Okay. So what I've been doing is, unlike most Israelis who watch the destruction of Gaza, you never see Gazan civilians on Israeli TV. So I watch Palestinian TikTok and Palestinian Instagram channels, and I see exactly what's happening. I don't know how much of it is 100% true or manipulated. I don't know. I'm taking it as this is at least what the way I take it is this is the way Palestinians perceive what's going on. And that's really hard. It's hard to see dead bodies of children. And I actually force myself to watch this because I think it's important. It's important to see these things.
Yeah. And I wanted to kind of get into that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, just in terms of the kind of images that are coming out and this new sort of version of history that's being written on TikTok and so on. But before that, do you think there is a sense of, when you're saying that they're celebrating the deaths of civilians, or the Israeli just saying that it's okay to shoot an 8-year-old child, and these kinds of incidents or sentiment, is there a sense that distinction between, say, Israeli soldier and Israeli civilian is gone, or between Palestinian civilian and Palestinian?
I think it was always blurred. More on the Palestinian side, absolutely, because I've heard for years and years and years. I heard this 30 years ago, actually, that every Israeli goes into the army, which is not entirely true, but most Israelis, about 60% of men, or 70% of men, 60% of women go into the army. So I've heard that from Palestinians, and I'm hearing it now since October 7th from Israelis about Palestinians. So, so what if children die? They're going to grow up to be terrorists anyways. And I've heard it a few times. It's not that rare anymore. Whereas before, that was the extreme opinion. That was an extremist. And now people are angry. And people are also angry. It's not just what happened on October 7th. There are hostages in Gaza who the assumption is they are being abused. They are possibly being raped. There are people who came out of Gaza who talked about seeing things, and they don't want to give too much information because this is a very conservative society in some ways about things like sexual abuse, and people don't like to talk about it. So I don't know exactly what happened on October 7th around that, or what's happening in Gaza, but it can't be good. It can't be very good with the way Hamas is treating people, just based on first person people talking about what happened. It's very, people are very angry at the moment. That's why it's hard for me to know if after, in a year after the war ends, will people start to calm down in their views? I don't know.
Yeah, it's to that, so we're talking about conversations between Israelis and Palestinians potentially. Which I don't have a lot of hope. One
thing I should touch on is that I am very unique in the sense of talking to Israelis and Palestinians. A lot of Arab Israelis are similar, meaning they will go into the West Bank and shop and go for dinner and things like that. Jewish Israelis do not interact with Palestinians in any way, almost, by meaning West Bank Palestinians, other than we used to have Palestinian workers from Gaza and the West Bank, and you would have very limited non-conversations with them, sort of like half Arabic, half Hebrew, where's the bathroom? How long have you been here? Like very shallow. So for the last 30 years, Israelis and Palestinians have, from the West Bank and Gaza, have moved further and further away from each other in terms of even knowing who the other is. So, I don't know. Either when you talk about conversations, I don't know who else is having conversations. Some settlers claim they have conversations with Palestinian workers. I am a little suspicious in the sense that most Palestinians don't speak Hebrew very well. Settlers barely speak any Arabic. There are very few people that would be able to have a substantial conversation of any depth on either side. So that makes it difficult. We don't speak the same language. We have we have very different cultures in that sense.
And for those, I mean, everybody who's listening, you're hearing Corey speak, and you really should go and watch the videos. I mean, go look up Corey Gil-Shuster. The link is going to be in the description of the YouTube channel. Corey Gil-Shuster, the Ask Project, and you really have to see these conversations for yourself.
And more important, just come here. It's actually not such a big deal to come here and walk around these places. It really is very easy. So I'd say come here. If you have an opinion about Israel Palestine, you should come here and spend 2 weeks with the group you disagree with. Try to convince them.
Yeah.
And then I would say listen as much as possible. Feel free to try to convince them of your view, but listen to what they have to say.
Yeah. So we're talking about like these conversations potentially between Israelis and Palestinians, but there's also, so on the larger scale, we had, recently with Israel trying to, and Arab states trying to normalize relationships between themselves, diplomatic relations like Saudi Arabia, the UAE. The Saudi Arabian Israeli deal was actually very close to being done at the time of this attack. So Yuval Noah Harari has been on saying this several times, and it's, that it seems like he's the only one saying this, but he says that the sheer brutality of the October 7th attack, the kind of like the really sadistic kinds of things that they did, and sort of streaming it and videoing it and everything, was that the goal was to seed hatred for generations, so that these conversations and these attempts at the normalization of diplomatic relations and so on could never happen for a very, very long time. And if this is indeed what the goal is, to really torpedo that and make it worse, does Hamas, in a sense, get exactly what they want as the polarization increases and the hate increases on both sides?
Well, I think I don't know if that. I think that's maybe was one of the sparks that. I mean, it's hard to know. We have to be in the minds of Sinwar and Hamas leadership to know exactly what they were thinking. But yes, that seems like a logical step, that this was one of the things that motivated them to act now. But Palestinians have been doing this and trying to do this for 100 years. Also, they want to get rid of Israel. Israel is a cancer in the Middle East. That's how they see it. And their goal is to return to what was Palestine of 1947, the original villages and everything, meaning I work at Tel Aviv University, and it's built on the ruins of Sheikh Munis, which was a small Palestinian village, a couple hundred people. The goal is to knock down Tel Aviv University and to build the village again. That to them, that's the goal. That's really the goal. All these other things are just the way they see it, the Palestinians see it, from what I get, is the world is always against Palestinians. The world hates Palestinians. That Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, are in bed with the Jews. They see it somewhat as the Jews are the manipulators of the world. We're like evil, conniving people who are manipulating everybody, and so they're also the enemy of the Palestinian people. So the fact that this Saudi Arabia, which has a lot of strength and power in the world, was creating an agreement, some kind of agreement with Israel, was seen as another threat. It's just another way to get further and further from that goal of returning to Palestine.
Yeah.
So does Hamas get what they want? Yeah, of course. Every time you use violence, that's the problem. Violence works. That is a problem. As much as we love to say we don't reward terrorism, in the end we do. It's a bit of hypocrisy to be saying that we're not giving in to the terrorists, but we always do. I mean, the reason that Israel left
negotiate with them too. I mean,
Sorry,
negotiate with them too. I mean, it's like Netanyahu's government. I mean, they said that, okay, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists, but then on the other hand, they're not.
They do in a sense, yeah. So that's the criticism of Netanyahu, and actually, it's not just Netanyahu; it's all the governments. Yeah. For the last 20 years, we've basically been allowing Qatar and Egypt to pay off Hamas to be as quiet as possible, and it would flare up every couple of years. So they could get more money. And the idea was, we're managing the conflict. That's the Israeli view. We're managing the conflict by giving them some money. And okay, but we're keeping it on a low flame because there's no solution. And then this broke, in the Israeli mind, this broke that agreement. And now the dominant Israeli view is we must destroy all resistance, all Palestinian resistance completely. All Hamas must end. Islamic Jihad must be destroyed. And even in Fatah, who also, by the way, uses violence all the time. They're just less violent and more willing for compromise. They also, Israel does not want to deal with them at all. And this is my criticism I always tell Israelis is, you always say we won't give in to violence. If they would put down their weapons, there would be peace. There's a lot of stick in the metaphor of the carrot and stick, but there's not much carrot going on here. What are you doing? What is the plan to give Palestinians some sense of hope? And nobody really thinks that far because we're all thinking through emotions. And I include myself in it because I get annoyed all the time by Palestinians, by Israelis too, but about this issue about Palestinians. But they're right that we don't, not that they really want, they want their lives to be better, but they don't want Israel to exist. But at the same time, we're not showing them any hope to why they should want Israel to exist. So there's a lot of blame here on the Israeli side as well. That's what I point out to Israelis.
Yeah, that's and it's so hard to talk about because no matter how you talk about this, and this is like I've had this experience too. No matter how you talk about it, everybody on every side is going to get to you because it's just such a polarized, such a tribal conflict. But so I wanted to like in along the part of the world, the society that I come from, which is mainly the Muslim world. And I grew up in, for those who don't know, I grew up in Libya and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. I only came to North America when I was 24. There's an element of the history that they feel is ignored in the conversation. So they say that, for example, when we compare October 7th to 9/11, they say, well, there was no occupation. The U.S. wasn't occupying them, and then they came and they attacked it. That's different. So there is this sort of backdrop of occupation, the fact that Palestinians can't vote, and all this historical.
Wait, hold on, clarify. West Bank and Gazan Palestinians within Israel absolutely vote. So okay, I'm just pointing that out because everyone forgets about that small element. But
that's right. Yeah. Right. So the Palestinians within the 20%, which is a pretty significant population of Palestinians that are Israeli citizens, they do vote, and they're represented also in government and everything. And again, we will get
not
to that.
Well, but yes.
Yeah. No, not we'll get to that in a bit. But there's there's this sense of the historical context. So how do you see? What do you think are some of the? And again, similar to the first question, what are, say, on either side, the most misunderstood things from your perspective about the history and the creation of Israel? Because that's really what drives
what I want to say. Well, let me think about it as I'm saying what I'm saying.
Sure, yeah.
The issue in conflicts. I studied conflict, so I'm going to go back to this because I think it's good to sort of take yourself out of a specific situation and see that these things are common. That everyone in conflict, any kind of conflict, starts history at a different time based on what their needs are. So Israelis start history when the Jews came to Canaan. 1200 BC. Is that, I'm getting the dates right? I think I don't remember. I'm terrible at dates. Okay. Palestinians start their history, with the Canaanites, and they've always been here. And each one, and then if you want to talk about then Palestinians start the next step is Balfour Declaration, and the Nakba. And then Israelis started in 1882. And everyone starts at a different time of when somebody else did something to them. And within each narrative, yeah, of course, there's a certain amount of it makes sense within. If you only hear the information of your own side, then it all makes sense to your side. But the problem is each side has its own stories, its own narratives, its own ways of understanding the situation that they're in.
But each side assumes that the other is also looking at the same history as them. That's one of the big problems.
And they're not at all.
Yeah, they're looking at a completely different aspect of history. Like, they're obviously, the way that Israel was created, for instance. I always try to, and I'm originally from Pakistan, so the way that Pakistan was created, it was carved out of India for a certain religious group. There were 14 million people who were displaced from their homes. Now people are like, well, at least they got their own place. There's no, but there is, when you're being kicked out of your home, whether you're a Sikh in sort of what's now Pakistan, that Punjab area, whether you're a Sikh there and your family's being killed, or whether there's somebody from outside coming and doing it, I mean, you're still being kicked out of your home where you've been for a very long time. So there's there's that sense. And then there's also, like we were talking earlier, there were a lot of Jews who, at the time, many Jews living in Arab countries like Morocco and Egypt and everything, and they were also expelled around that time. And so I think that there are, when you read about the historical, they're actually even documented very, very differently, the histories of both sides. So I think that a lot of times the Muslim world, right, the Arab world, will look at the way that Israel is conducting itself, and they're going to look at it from the perspective of their idea of history, and it'll be the same vice versa. So I think that's a really,
also each side. Sorry, let's geek out on this. Each side plugs it into an existing framework. So if you're Muslim and you see yourself as the end religion, the Jews came along and God spoke to them, and then they went against God. And then the Christians came and they went against God. And then the Muslims, that's the true religion. These are the
3.0.
people. So then suddenly this group of Jews who are not supposed to be, okay, fine, we'll respect them. Sure, it says in the Quran we're supposed to, but at the same time, they really should be Muslim. And they don't have the same rights we do because we're the true religion. Then they carve out this part of our land. How dare these people do this? Plus, there's lots of myths about the Jews and what they do and how devious they are and all this stuff. And so, juxtapose that with how the Jews see themselves as
chosen people.
God is bringing them back. That's what most Mizrahi Jews, by the way, and didn't go into this, but most Jews from the Arab countries came back to Israel because they thought the Messiah is coming. That's what most Jews did from Morocco and Kurdistan and Iraq and all these places, because that's our belief. I mean, not mine, I'm an atheist, but it doesn't matter. That's a Jewish belief that we're going to come back and the Messiah is going to come. So each one is doing things for its own purposes, and the others are plugging into their own frameworks and ideas about the other. And then it spins off into a million different areas, because you're right. All the people, it doesn't matter if you're a Jew in Libya or a Palestinian living in Ramle, you're thrown out of your house, which happened to both. Physically, were thrown out to both. You're going to be bitter against the person who threw you out. Now, in the Jewish case, they went to something much more positive, a country which is actually much more successful. Palestinian case, they made a decision also to be victims until they get exactly what they want back. I mean, the good thing, I would say the Jews were smart, sort of, in that they were willing to accept less at the time. Meaning the state of Israel, without, because Israel, actually, if you look at Jewish thought, it's supposed to be in the West Bank, really, because that was Judea. And we didn't get that till 67. So, but if you're that average Palestinian, this is going to be your part of your belief system. I have to go back. This is to fulfill what gives me myself sense of identity. I have to go back to that original place.
Yeah. So, again, coming from that, I wanted to talk about the just the current government in Israel and the coalition, and the obviously been a lot
Yeah.
of domestic political issues there. First of all, this October 7th attack. People do compare it to 9/11, but it's 9/11 was still very unexpected. It was a very unconventional way to go about things, the way that Al Qaeda did it. But with this, I mean, this is just something that it's and this is one of Netanyahu's main criticisms is that it's just something that was expected. It was something that was being monitored the whole time. So the fact that it actually caught them unawares, I mean, so what? How do you feel about that? Do you think this was like a big miss? Because it was
So look, understand that's why I say you have to come here to understand things. Because first of all, on the one hand, it was very shocking how big it was and how brutal and animalistic it was for Israelis. That's what I'm saying. But the fact that it happened, first of all, I think we underestimated Palestinians in terms of how organized they could be, because it was pretty organized. But if you are Israeli or a person who comes to Israel, like as a Canadian like me, Israelis are incredibly incompetent and incredibly bad. There's this myth about the Israeli government. I'm sorry. Everyone thinks it's the best army in the world. Anyone who has served in the IDF, most people will say there's huge amount of incompetence going on, huge amount of wasted resources, of incompetence, of people who have no clue what they're doing. Israelis live in this little world where they think that they're the best, so they're a bit arrogant about it. But anybody who was American or Canadian, which were a very small little group, who came and I didn't serve in the army, but people I know did. The stories I hear are shocking. It's very third world. It's very, nobody knows what they're doing. Everyone thinks that they know what they're doing, and they're just arrogant children. So to the point where I know the stories of, for example, for a Palestinian has to apply for a permit, for example, and there's an office that deals with that. And at the end of the day, a bunch of 20-year-olds, if they don't finish their work, they just dump all the requests into the garbage because they're like, well, whatever, too late. What are you going to do? Because nobody knows what they're doing and everyone's incompetent. And nobody cares. They're a bunch of self-absorbed 20-year-olds who don't care. And they're all constantly being told, if you live in Israel, you know this, you're constantly told you're the best and you're so wonderful. And this is the best and most country in the world with the best army in the world. But they're not. They are not the best army. They're not even, there's some good things. There's some terrific things. I don't want to paint it as 100% negative. But the fact that something like this didn't happen before is actually more shocking than it happened. To this scale, I'm surprised. I am surprised by the scale of it and the barbarity of what happened from the Palestinian side, what they did. But the screw ups that happened, not surprising at all. And it was a combination of a bunch of things. It was political. Netanyahu promised his extremist settler people to move. He moved a bunch of the platoons and the units, or whatever they're called, into the West Bank. It was a holiday, so a lot of people were on leave. There were people who were warning something, like, meaning there's a thing called watchers, onlookers. They're women who sit in a room and they watch the monitors of Gaza, and they're like, something's going on, something's weird. But you know what? Things like that have been going on for forever. It's not that odd. And their officers said, no, it's nothing, and ignored them because everyone thinks they know better. That's a very Israeli thing. I know better than you. In the end, there's going to be a lot of investigations into this, and there's a lot of people who are going to lose their job. I really hope, because and I hope this teaches Israelis a lesson in incompetence. They're very arrogant and they're very not competent in what they do, and I mean that in all ways. I don't want to out anybody, but I've worked in many industries, and the level of incompetence is shocking. So compared, not far off from, you lived in Libya or Saudi Arabia, not far off. We're just a little better. I think that's our joke. I have a friend who's American here who was in the army, served in Gaza, and he said, our luck as Jews and Israelis is that we're just a bit smarter than the Arab. This much. That's it. Nothing else.
Yeah.
And he was saying it like jokingly, like he's, because this idea that Jews are really smart. He was saying it in a joking way, saying, no, this country is very developing world. Nobody knows what they're doing.
There is so let's get into the public perception of Israel. There's so much I want to talk about, and I know that we've got limited time, but yeah, it's such a huge topic. So the public perception of Israel right now among ages 18 to 34, I think I'm getting it right, or 18 to I think 29 maybe. According to like a couple of polls in the U.S., the majority of American youth, right, in the United States, is now sympathizing with Palestinians. It's over 50%, which is a huge change compared to at least when I was growing up. And it seems like there's a new, like what I was saying earlier, there's a new version of history that's being written on TikTok. I mean, a lot of these younger people, with everything that's happened, the response that's happened in Gaza, all of the bombing, for many of them, when they've seen this stuff so graphically, and I've seen videos of just young 7-8-year-old girls age my daughter with their bones exposed, being operated upon without anesthesia, and it's very, very harrowing, very difficult to watch. And so when you have hundreds of these videos, maybe even thousands online, people's memory of October 7th, a lot of people watching this is sort of it's disappearing. And these are people, again, who weren't even born at the time of 9/11, or they may have been infants at that time. The Holocaust for them is just grainy black and white images from a century ago. And this stuff is animated, it's dynamic, it's constant, and it's in full color, up close. It's like there's a new history that's being written. And it seems to me like, and especially the way I know that for Israel, and this is, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, it seems like for Israel, there is a trigger that's been set off. Like in the images of October 7th that you saw happening live, this is obviously a hugely sensitive spot, and that's an understatement. Where this brand of sort of statistic, brutal violence is, there are people I have Jewish friends here who spent their whole lives in the United States and Canada, thinking that they spend it pretty protected, enjoying all the rights and freedoms that everybody else has. I mean, people are in a good spot here. And then after this happened, they're seeing their own friends, and they feel like everybody's turning against them, and they feel like everything that their grandparents and parents told them that they never directly experienced, but just sort of heard about, is coming true. So there is an almost one of my friends, in the first episode of this show, I had my friend Michael Spitz, who's he's an American, Jewish American, son of Hungarian Holocaust survivors, and he was saying that usually when it comes to Jewish people, especially in the U.S., they're always thinking in nuance, always trying to look at the other side. There's all the the Nobel Prizes and all of the other stuff that's happening. But when it comes to this trigger of extreme violence, there's sort of a curtain that drops, and they just go into pure reactive mode as soon as the Israel issue comes up. So I guess the question now is that with this public perception, this new version of history that's being written. What do you think the Israeli government should be doing? What are they doing wrong now? And what is the alternative? How should they go about it? Is this something that they're actually thinking about in long term?
Well, first of all, the government is incredibly incompetent, because it's a whole thing. And a lot of people theorize it's because Bibi puts in weak people around him so he could be the leader, King Bibi, that kind of thing. So this is, I don't even know what's going to happen with them. What should they do? The problem is that you're seeing this from a North American perspective, and nobody in Israel sees that. Or if they do see it, they don't care. They couldn't care less. Israelis, for at least 20, 30 years, see themselves as this lone island where the world just hates Jews. And you know what? They can all fuck off. Whatever, their problem. Nobody cares. I just had this argument with a coworker who said, I don't care what the world thinks about us. It doesn't matter. They're all going to hate us anyways. We might as well. If they think we're doing a genocide, yeah, we might as well do a genocide. What's the difference? We don't think we're doing a genocide. We don't hate them just because they're Palestinian. But if the world anyways is going to accuse us of these things, you know what? Screw them. Who cares? And I keep explaining to her, yes, but we live in an interconnected world where people are not going to buy our products, and we're not going to be able to import the same things we might have been able to import. And she's like, I don't care. So we'll suffer. We don't care. I couldn't care less, because people are thinking again through emotions, and they don't care what the world thinks about them anymore at all. And it's a mix of arrogance. I agree. It's completely arrogant. And when you feel that you're the one who's always being beaten up, and that's how Israeli Jews really do feel. And some of it is really victim complex and arrogance. But so it's not, but it did shock me. And I'm the reason, let me back up for a second. The reason I got involved in conflict studies is I grew up in a family where everyone thinks that that the Jews are hated, and it made no sense to me because I never experienced anti-Semitism in Ottawa. I don't know what you're talking about. And they would see Nazis in every corner. Like, you'd go to the supermarket, somebody speaking German, oh, they're a Nazi. Oh, this guy is speaking Arabic, he must hate Jews. So to me, I had the opposite reaction of, no, you got to prove to me that you're really anti-Semitic. Now, why am I explaining this? Since October 7th, I'm like, holy crap, there are a lot of Jew haters out there. That surprised me, how much I see on TikTok, because that's what I'm doing, watching what the kids are watching, of a lot of Jew hatred or a lot of misinformation about Jews, not about Israel necessarily, about Jews
there's
going on.
Absolutely.
And I'm like, whoa, like you said, your friend is like, our grandparents were right. They do just hate the Jews. This is just about being Jewish. I think there's an element of truth in that. Now, part of that is like my shock, but part of it is I think there's a bit of truth in that.
I was, and I want to say this because I know you're saying this, but I want to say this too, like based on how I grew up, is that two things can be true.
Yes.
You know, it can be true that, you know, the Israeli occupation is terrible. Settlement expansion is crazy. I mean, some of the fact that it's getting more and more, I guess, quote unquote, theocratic with these coalitions with, you know, the religious extremists in Israel, you know, that's all true. That's not good. But at the same time, I grew up in Saudi Arabia. I grew up as a Pakistani.
You heard the crap they say about
I've heard it, everywhere. I mean, every Arab, every Muslim knows this. They've heard it in their extended families, maybe even their immediate families, that, you know, there's this thing. There is an issue with Jews as well. It's not just Israel, and Israel becomes a kind of we're criticizing Israel, we're not criticizing the Jews, or, you know, we're anti-Zionist, we're not anti-Semitic. And it is true, like, they're not these, they don't think that a lot of people have here in North America, you know, they're not necessarily, like, people aren't really aware of the nature of their biases. A lot of people don't realize Zionism.
Yeah, they don't realize they're mixing these things together.
Yeah, like Zionism is as much a part of Jewish religion as
it is. It actually is. I mean,
actually is the basis of it.
Zionism to some people, but yes, this idea of the return of the Jews to their native land. Again, I'm an atheist, so to me that makes no sense.
So am I. That's you. We have that.
But it's really believed. I recognize I'm the minority, so it really is believed by almost all Jews, including anti-Zionist Jews. Anti-Zionist,
it's like jihad, and
the Jews also believe you have to return. It's just not now. That's the only difference. Anyways, point is, so wait, back to your question though. If what do I think the government should do? If I were the government and I was smart, is showing some level of compassion for the Palestinians and constantly repeating the mantra is we are open to negotiations. We kind of say it, but we say it as you screwed up. We were willing to negotiate. Now it's you're paying the price. If I were Netanyahu, for example, I would have set up, this was my idea, set up a table every Friday, and I would wait and publicly humiliate the Palestinian side. I would wait at the table as the negotiation, like a pretend negotiation table, and sit there every week. Now it's absolute theater, but if they were smart, that's what they would do. they make these claims that yes, we're very open to compromise and we're very open to seeing the Palestinian side. So okay, show it. I want to see you show it, and I want to see what you're willing to do. What are the on the ground steps that you're willing to make so Palestinians can have normal lives like Israelis have normal lives, or somewhat normal lives. That's what they should do. Now, nobody's going to do it because in conflict, that's not how people act. That's how we in Canada would act, because we have things easy. I can, I've lived here for 20 something years. I can still keep that because I grew up in Canada. So I don't have the trauma of living through, or I'm going through a war at 50 something, not at 15 or 20 something in the army.
Yeah. So speaking of like Jews in Canada and the US, I mean, one of the things that at least Netanyahu's kind of done during his time is that there has been an increasing alienation of North American Jews now. Whereas, like you said, in Israel, a lot of people are like, they're going to hate us anyway, so we might as well go for it, and we don't really care about public world opinion. That's not the case with Jewish people in the US and Canada and outside in the diaspora, right?
Most Jews, just to explain to your viewers, most Jews see Israel as kind of replaced the synagogue, or there used to be a temple in Jerusalem, and the synagogue replaced the temple. And now Israel has replaced the synagogue in a sense, because most Jews are not that religious anymore. So Israel is like this idea of what it means to be Jewish. But Israel doesn't share the same view. The Israelis, they think it's interesting if you're Jewish, but we have something in common. That's really interesting. But they don't really care if what they're doing is making Jewish lives difficult in North America. Couldn't care less. Doesn't matter. Come move to Israel. You have a problem, move to Israel.
But there is so I think that, and this is a question about how long how long can this go on? Like, just in the sense that with Netanyahu, I mean, so that part of it, but let's zoom in a little bit. So I'm talking about the Netanyahu government, right? Yeah. And everything that's happened for many, many years. He's been around for a while. So there are a couple of things that are happening. First of all, this sort of, I guess, this difference between the American Jews and Israeli Jews, the way that they think, their politics, their view of the world, their concerns about the perception of Jews around the world. That's one thing that's become sort of they've separated more and more over time. The other thing is the in the United States, at least, Israel had pretty much bipartisan support from Democrats and Republicans. It was solid, it was strong, it was reliable. And one thing that's happened with the Netanyahu government is they've actually made Israel a partisan issue. I don't know why that he decided to go that way. Came in and said, okay, we've got 100% support. Let's just cut it down to 50%. Let's just take the Republicans and alienate the Democrats, even though most American Jews vote Democrats still. And that supports.
He's concerned with his electorate. He's not that concerned. He's concerned with, and he assumed that the Republicans are always going to support him. So it's good enough.
Yeah. But I mean, he also had the Democrats supporting him. I mean, they were very, very strong.
But they're seen as the left, or the more extreme left in the Democrat.
So it was,
he's going to be anti-Israel, and there's nothing you can do about it. Ignore them.
Yeah, it just seems so short-sighted and so it's mindless. And then the other thing is the settlement expansion and gunning for the one-state solution, and you know about and I wanted to get your perspective on this. They call it demographic time bomb. Is that if there is a binational state
nobody's talking about a binational state. Nobody. Palestinians are not. Israelis are not. No.
But if they
want all of Palestine, and it's Palestine, all of it. Tel Aviv is Palestine. It's all Palestine. Israelis want all of Israel. West Bank is Israel. Tel Aviv is Israel. It's all Israel. Jerusalem is Israel.
So if you have
that's the one state according to each side.
Okay.
And so then you ask Palestinians, well, what does that mean for the Jews? And they go, I don't care. They can leave. They should leave. They can live under Palestine, under Islam and Arab Islam, or leave, or they should leave. Most of them actually say that. It doesn't matter. Israelis say Palestinians will have some form of independence. They already do in the Palestinian Authority, so 40% of the West Bank, and that should be good enough for them. That's it. That's what they're getting.
So, but the question. So if we're talking about Israel as a Jewish democratic state, okay,
Mhm.
and you have everyone there, supposing everyone there gets a vote, around 50% of the population is
But the
Arab.
Palestinians wouldn't get a vote.
That's the question. So is it going to be the demographic time bomb issue? Is that eventually Israel is going to have to choose, if they're going for a single state, they're going to have to choose between being either a Jewish state, right, or a democracy, but they can't be both. So do you agree with that?
Functionally, you're right, but that's not how it's talked about. It's talked about that, first of all, Israel itself is 20% Arab or non-Jewish and 80% Jewish. Stays the same. That's fine. In the West Bank, there's 3 million Palestinians. They wouldn't be, well, majority say they wouldn't be citizens. Actually, it's the right wing and the more extreme settlers who want them to be citizens because they don't care about that. Couldn't care less. But they probably wouldn't have the exact same rights. It's never very clear. Meaning, I always ask, can a Palestinian be prime minister? Can they be minister of defense? And they shouldn't say always, most of the time they say no. So they have all social rights, but not all political rights. Gaza is completely out of it. Nobody wants Gaza. Nobody. Israelis don't want Gaza. Palestinians don't really want Gaza. Egypt doesn't want Gaza.
Egypt doesn't want Gaza. Like nobody
wants Gaza. So yes. So in this fantasy of most Israelis, it's just going to work itself out somehow. It's never thought of more than 5 years down the line. The Palestinians will have the PA, the Palestinian Authority under Abbas, and he's their leader, and all the Jews and the Arab Israelis will have the Prime Minister of Israel, period. And Gaza somewhere else out. So none of this really makes sense in the long run. You're right. It
doesn't make any sense. Like it's bizarre, and that makes me think of one more thing. And I know we're at time, but if you can be generous with another 5 minutes, I would be
no problem. Go with it.
Yeah, I have. There's this. So it wonders. You say that people should come to the ground here in Israel and Palestine, see how things are. I wonder if there are certain aspects of the situation that can be seen more objectively by people who are not on the ground. Like, again, I'm going to quote Yuval Noah Harari, who's saying something like, he said that when you are on the ground there, right, and you are holding your dead child in your hand, whether you're Israeli on October 7th, or whether you're in Gaza, and that's the position that you're in, it's impossible to see yourself as a victim and an aggressor at the same time. So you can't see yourself as a victim and an insurgent or a terrorist. You can't see yourself as a victim and an oppressor and an occupier at the same time, simultaneously. So those perspectives are pretty much impossible to hold. But if you're not millions, I guess thousands of miles away, and you're looking at the situation from kind of a bird's eye view, then you can see that. You can see that people can be the victim and the aggressor at the same time.
You can't wait. Let me go back to your Gen Z thing, though. You can, but for some odd reason, this new generation refuses to look, or many of this new generation refuses to look at it that way, and that is my criticism of them.
Yeah,
of all these pro-Hamas people. I'm like,
but our generation, like the generation before them, like, again, we've got two separate things of history. We've polarized our media.
Agreed.
Everybody just watches the TV channels that support their view. I mean, it's a very I have nieces and nephews. My daughter's very young right now, but I have nieces and nephews who are part of Gen Z now, and I have a lot of discussions with them, and they feel very strongly about it. There's this idea that you have to, there's a side, you take the side, and then and they don't understand that the thing that fuels a tribal conflict like this is the polarization. So you want to be polarized because it's so emotionally fraught, but at the same time, the more polarized you are, the more oxygen the conflict gets, and it gets even more polarized. So it's a sort of like a positive feedback cycle, just continues that keeps going. So I think a lot of the and they want to understand, like they want to talk about it, they want to hear about it. I mean, again, not all of them, but some of them, they want to understand, but they just don't. I think a lot of it is the way that we've presented it to them, because there's, I mean, they're only seeing, I mean, they're only reading what's out there, and lot of different
Well,
things.
there's lots of elements in that. I mean, we set up a culture where we appreciate the underdog and only like the underdog, and we don't,
Right.
and therefore the other side must be an oppressor, 100%, and that's not really always, often is not the case.
Yeah.
And that we have media, by the way, I blame the media for a lot of this, where they send people to Israel, Palestine, who know no Hebrew, no Arabic, and come in with their own assumptions and create reports based on their own views. I know somebody from a Middle Eastern media station, who said, find me a Mizrahi Jew, like a Jew of Middle Eastern origin, who suffers because the Ashkenazi, the European Jews, abuse him. Find me that so I can write a story about him. And I'm like, that doesn't exist anymore. Maybe 60 years ago, if it did. And no, I'm not feeding your need for your Middle Eastern viewers to see bad European Jews versus the wonderful Arab Jews. So yeah, we have a problem here. How it's been reported, how TikTok works, how all these things feed into this cycle of how people understand it.
Yeah, I've had.
You're right. It does feel. It's not the reason, because obviously it's Israelis and Palestinians who are trying to kill each other all the time. But this does not help. This does not help in any way. That's why I say come here.
I've been asked to, like, I wrote this article in 2014 that just went everywhere in HuffPost. It's translated on all of their languages, and it was called 7 Things to Consider When Choosing Sides in the Middle East. And I'll put a link to it. And it was interesting because I got a lot of interview requests, and I did a lot of media. And because I come from the Muslim Arab world and I grew up there, but it was, I used to tell my friends, and I still do now, that it's like, it's funny because I'm not Palestinian, I'm not Israeli, I'm not anything, but like they just want to know. I mean, there's a,
close like you enough. Said, you're dark skinned, you're Muslim.
I will say that I do, like, I am obviously I'm very informed on it. I stand by the article that I wrote. I know that I did get a lot of people who are on the ground in Israel and in Palestine who liked it, who appreciated it. But at the same time, I think that is an issue with the media. I think there's a perspective, and I wanted to, like, the last question I wanted to ask you. Actually, it's not really the last I want to ask you, but the last I guess I probably will, but because we're at time. But I wanted to. There's not a whole lot I'm seeing about Israeli Arabs. I know that there's a very famous sort of Israeli Palestinian named Naz Daily. He's like this viral guy on Facebook. I think he did a travel vlog.
Yep.
He
he's
talked
still doing
about
stuff. I see him every so often, and on social media.
Yeah. So he's not, and he doesn't really talk about the issue as much. But he came out and he recently said after October 7th that, hey, even though he grew up Muslim, he's Palestinian, but he's an Israeli citizen. He said, I'm Israeli first, and I'm Palestinian.
That surprised me, actually, when he said that. I thought that was, I mean, I okay, go ahead. I'll
I guess, the question is that, and you've done interviews with, and kudos to you. I mean, it's one of the very few places where I've seen you talk to Israeli Arabs, like Arabs who are Israeli citizens, and they have obviously the views are complicated and complex, just like everybody else's. But what is it that what is your sort of what are you sensing from them, like in terms of how they're perceiving this whole situation and where they feel caught in the middle? I remember watching
this situation specifically.
This situation, and I guess, and overall the situation.
Let me give you an overall. First of all, I would say they are very in the middle, in a sense that they're Arab, Muslim, some Christian, feel Palestinian mostly, or some connection to because they're from here and they have actual relatives in the West Bank and Gaza. It hasn't been that long; it's only been 80 years, so some of them have relatives in these places still. But they've been Israelified. If I could make up a word, meaning they've lived under an Israeli system, which at first was oppressive to them until 66, I think it was. They were living under martial law, not everywhere, but in a lot of places. They've been better integrated in the last 20, 30 years into the Israeli economy. Still not fully. They're still poorer than most Jews, but better. They now speak Hebrew a lot better than they did 30, 40 years ago. The idea of serving in the government 40 years ago would have been traitorous, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. Now it is not. Since Abbas, the Muslim Brotherhood, served in an the Israeli government with right-wing people, left and right, in a coalition. It broke a taboo, which is amazing. I'm very happy. The thing I like most is when Israeli Arabs serve in the army and they are in the government, because I think that's your best way of becoming integrated and feeling like you're at the same level. Like they call it being a second-class citizen. So most Arab Israelis feel they are second class. And I say, well, what does that mean? And they say it's a feeling. It's not legally they have all the rights, but they feel they're always getting screwed over. And there's lots of rumors. Again, there's also lots of misinformation within Arab Israeli society about how they're screwed over, because I know some of them are absolutely not true. For example, they'll often say that they're not allowed into universities in Israel, like to be students. It's actually the opposite. They are 25% of at least of Tel Aviv University, 35% of Haifa University, and the Technion. They actually are disproportionately more educated than the Jews.
I didn't know that.
By far, yes, by far.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go to Haifa University, you would think you're in a Palestinian university. Now where they are, here, let me just throw in another thing. I remember I studied at Haifa University also, saying there's so many Arabs, why don't they open up a intro political science class in Arabic? Like, how University of Ottawa will have the same course in French and in English because it's a bilingual university. They don't have that. And all the Jews said, no, this is a Jewish state. You can't have it in Arabic. They have to learn Hebrew. Now, for integration purposes, I get it, but that doesn't seem very, as Canadian, that doesn't seem very fair to me. Anyways, point is that they do have reason to be thinking, I don't think I'm appreciated. I don't think I'm, really considered the same in the same way, but legally they are. What is my point here? My point is, when I ask them these questions, they are the least likely, for the YouTube channel, they're the least likely to answer me out of any group, because they feel like they're going to get screwed by somebody. They're going to, either the government is watching them. They're sure the government is always watching them. Maybe true. Could be true that the intelligence, meaning for security reasons, checking who's a terrorist, who's not, could be true. No idea. Never worked in intelligence, so I don't know. And their families and their relatives in the West Bank will also screw them over. So if they say the wrong thing, they can. And in Arab society, it's very mafia. In Arab society, you say the wrong thing, you can get into trouble, and that could mean getting beaten or killed. That can happen. Yeah. So they feel the most in the middle in that sense, meaning they understand both sides to a certain degree, and they feel like they're getting screwed by both sides to a certain degree. So I keep putting to them that they actually have a key role in this, because they understand better than anyone what is going on, even though they also live in their own little bubble of illusions about what's going on. But it doesn't matter. They have a better understanding of both sides, and they could connect both sides. But they feel there's a certain amount of feeling like you're a traitor to your people if they did that.
Yeah. So
they have to feel like they're making both sides happy. I don't know if this is, well, you lived in Arab countries. I mean, that's very true, I'm assuming, because here in the Levant, anyway, so Lebanon and Israel, Palestine, you have all these different minority groups, Syria, different minority groups, and each one of them feels like they have a foot in both places. So if you're Samaritan or Circassian or Druze, you're never really going to piss off the Muslims or the Alawites or the whoever, because it could come back at you easily with violence and death. So they always have this feeling like, we don't want to rock the boat, but at the same time, we don't feel like things are fair for us.
Do you feel that any of them have been, do you think they've been, I know Nas Daily was, but do you think that there are others, Israeli Arabs who have spoken out more after October 7th or less?
Oh, I don't know about more, but okay. So the surprising thing about October 7th is that in previous rounds of or wars, whatever you want to call them, whether in Lebanon or in Gaza or the West Bank, more Israeli Arabs rioted in solidarity with their Palestinian cousins.
Mhm.
This time it didn't happen at all. No
Yeah.
protests, almost no protests. There was like little protests in Jaffa, little, I've seen like, but we're talking 10 people, 15 people, and no violent riots. Usually most protests here are violent. Most Arab protests are turn very violent very quickly,
Mhm.
meaning stone throwing, by the way,
Yeah.
and sometimes Molotov cocktails. This time it didn't happen. And part of me is waiting for the other shoe to drop, thinking it could happen. But from what I've been, because I've been to a few Arab Israeli towns lately asking questions, they were traumatized also by what happened on October 7th, because at least 20 Israeli Arabs, Palestinians, were murdered by
Murder.
Hamas.
Yeah. Mhm.
A bunch of them were taken as hostages. So I've met people who know people who were murdered, Arab Israelis, who I always just thought, oh, they're, it's Bedouins in the south. I met people in the north who like, no, I know people who were killed or were taken hostage, because everyone is somewhat related here. And they are very shocked by what Hamas did. To them, it seemed very primitive, very barbaric.
Yeah.
And that might be the Israelification. This sounds very insulting to Arab
Yeah.
culture,
Yeah.
but I think there's a certain amount of like, you grow up, and if you're a 30 or 40-year-old Arab who lives in Israel, you have a much higher quality of life than your parents and grandparents have had. You are not exposed to the same levels of violence that used to happen in the Middle East a long time ago. It's not just Israel, actually, and it's mostly wealth, if anything, because the Gulf states are the same. There's been a change in the Gulf in how people perceive what Arab culture is now.
Mhm.
And I think they feel like we're kind of all in the same boat to a certain degree. But at the same time, they watch what's happening because they watch Al Jazeera. They watch what's happening in Gaza, and they're really concerned, and really they don't want people in Gaza to be killed. So
I mean, a lot of Israelis, a lot of Jewish people here. I mean, they don't want that either. I mean,
yeah,
I think that there's a lot of that's kind of it's almost universal. But yeah, that's really that's really interesting. It must be difficult to be like just being caught between the two. So it's but anyway, I want to. There's probably a lot more that I could ask you about. Obviously, I mean this conflict has been ongoing for a while. There's so many angles to it.
yeah.
But just overall, but I think we'll wrap it up now. Just where do you see this ending? I mean, it's Hamas going to get destroyed?
No
Will
idea.
there
No
be?
idea.
Yeah,
No idea.
yeah.
I wish. I mean, part of me actually supports this war. I don't support, civilians and in Gaza being killed to this extent, because It's hard to know, because I don't know if we can trust what Hamas says in terms of numbers. But a lot of civilians are getting killed.
Yeah.
So and by the way,
I mean,
also,
half of the population of Gaza is children. It's
yes, it's also a
the,
very young population. People die early in Gaza. They have a lot of health issues. There's a lot going on. It's very poor in that sense. But there are also a lot of Gazan civilians who take part in Hamas. They're part of it. I mean, when people talk about it was Hamas coming into Israeli communities, most of the people who came into Israeli communities were actually civilians. Now they might work with Hamas, but they were people in flip flops and t-shirts who were killing people. Also, it wasn't
yeah.
just Hamas. Actually, Hamas, from the reports, it seems that the Hamas soldiers, the ones wearing actual kind of uniforms, whatever you call that, were tended to be less violent than the average people. Thousands of people came in from Gaza that day.
There's this thing that I think a lot of times, and this is another thing that people don't like. We're talking about the numbers coming from Hamas, and there's a lot of people on the Israeli side who don't trust them. Like, these numbers are coming from Hamas, and then there are people in at least in the on the other side who I hear from, who just don't, everyone says, okay, well, they're pro-Hamas, that means to support everything that happened on October 7th. And because they're rallying in support of it, but they're actually, they just don't believe that those atrocities were carried out. They don't think, they think it's all propaganda. They think that it's something that was just, it's that the Israelis are making up, like, Hamas.
I know. I see all those myths.
And it's so a lot of times
really killed them, and none of that is true.
Yeah.
I have videos. I have a
but,
video.
Yeah. So sorry, I was just going to say that. So a lot of them, they're being told that they support terrorism. They support everything that happened on October 7th based on what people believe happened on October 7th or what actually did. But they don't believe it happened. They think it was just
there's video that I have a hard time dealing with, because there's
I know.
I have it on my phone. I can show you a beheading, an actual beheading of a Thai.
No, I've seen that stuff.
I even checked it. I even checked, like, maybe this is from somewhere else, and I sent it to Palestinian friends. They said, no, that's a Gaza accident.
Yeah, but it's about the. So I know I've seen the same videos. I've heard from the same people. So I know it happened. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. But I'm just saying that the way that they perceive it, a lot of these people that are saying, we're not pro-terrorism. We just don't think those things happen. Well,
no, that's okay. That's why I also distinguish when people go to rallies for Palestine.
It's a complicated,
but it doesn't necessarily mean that they support killing of civilians. So that's why I ask people, when people say free Palestine, I go, well, what do you mean? Give me a definition, and then I'll judge whether it's, if it means killing civilians or not, or if it means you only hate me because I'm Jewish or not. Then I'll start to judge. But I mean, most people don't think that way. Most people are, they judge on emotions, and it's black and white. And if you're pro this, or if you're anti this, you're pro this. If you're pro this, you're anti. That's how people think.
That's how people think. Yeah, you never hear about people being pro Sweden or anti Canada. It's just this is the only one of the few places in the world where people talk about that. But listen, Corey, I mean, what you're doing, I think, is just having these conversations, listening to people. I know that it's going to be really difficult. I know you said that it's going to be really hard for you to go back, but I do hope that you do, because I think that the kind of perspectives that you brought to just the world is just I know that you already have a lot of views, but they're just not enough still. I think more.
No, they're not enough, because there's so many people who talk about this conflict, and I'm like, well, at least know what the people involved think. That's all I ask for. Then you can judge. If you want to judge Israelis, Palestinians, go ahead. But at least know what they actually say and think, not just one person. I'm talking about a mainstream, a major group of people.
And you're getting direct responses from them, and I know we haven't mentioned this, but you take questions from people that are emailed to you. You direct them to the other side, and you don't edit it. You don't, you're waiting.
Nothing is left out.
Nothing is left out. Everything is really presented the way it is, and it's really something to
even
watch.
When it's painful for me. Unless the only time is if it puts someone's life at risk or they ask to be taken out. That's it. That's the only times I've ever taken anything out. Yeah,
it's it's just right now when everybody's kind of going to media sources that just confirm what they already believe. I think this is just something that I would just recommend everybody, no matter whether you're in Generation X or Millennial or Z or whatever it is. It's just something that you should watch, because it's just absolutely. I just think it's one of the best things that's out there, just in terms of people understanding each other. But I appreciate your time. Thanks a lot for coming on. If you enjoyed this conversation, please, first of all, go to the Ask Project and check out Corey's work. Also, with this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you can hear about the new episodes that we have, and then we'll continue. And this will be on Apple, Spotify, all the other platforms very, very soon in audio form. But please feel free to share it as much as you can and give us a rating. It'll really, really help us get off the ground properly here. So, Corey, thank you very much, and I really, really appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Ali, for having me.
You can just